The ragtime compositions of C.L. Woolsey are a form of folk ragtime, or as I increasingly call the genre, the small town sound. It's a ragtime subgenre that has a lot in common with classic ragtime, but is generally much less sophisticated, less ambitious, looser, more medley-like, and it contains certain musical technical traits at times, idiosyncratic treatment of part writing and voicing that's quite different. It's an interesting mixture of the unlettered and the inventive. Some folk rags are more sophisticated. You'll hear both with Woolsey. With pieces like Medic Rag and Funny Bones, there's the presence of a more professional arranging, whether it was Woolsey being an irregular treater of his own music or an arranger was assigned, in the case of Funny Bones, by the Remick Company, who published it, a major publisher at the time. But those are some of the things to know about the general genre picture of C.L. Woolsey. What a quietly colorful figure he really was. The small-town doctor who composed on the side and did a variety of other interesting things that all the local people around Braymer, Missouri knew about. Everybody knew Doc Lee Woolsey, and I think everybody probably knew quite a bit about his life. It might have been quiet, but it was certainly distinctive and had its own unusual side, as talking to people in Braymer revealed readily to me 44 years ago when I made this grand adventure of my first full-fledged solo research project. I'll tell you a bit about that trip. I learned about Woolsey from Trevor J. Tishner, the well-known ragtime scholar, composer, pianist, collector, one of the leading collectors, especially in the history of ragtime and ragtime-related scores, piano rolls, and biographical material. Trevor had published two pieces of Woolsey's, Medic Rag and Mashed Potatoes, in the folio called Ragtime Rarities, which I got in 1976. That was my first exposure to Woolsey, and I was intrigued by both of these pieces in their very different ways. Things would go along quietly with Woolsey in my life until late 78 and early 79, when Trevor Tishner became a good friend of mine. I was over at his house for the first time in November of 78, and it's possible that he mentioned Woolsey to me then, bringing him a bit further to life, but it most definitely in the winter of 79, it was in February, I spent 2 weeks with Trevor and his family in St. Louis. And at that point, I was introduced to the full range of Woolsey's ragtime compositions, because Trevor had all the scores, of course. And I soon decided I wanted to play most of these pieces publicly, and very soon after that, over a course of a few months, I made an opportunity to do the first-hand research that became my big adventure into Braymer, working out of Kansas City in September of 79. My friend, the late John Dawson, helped me with this. He was based in Kansas City. He took me over to meet Hugh Paul, a man living in Norburn, Missouri, who Trevor told me about. He had asked me if I knew Hugh Paul. It turns out Hugh Paul is one of the three kids on the cover of Mashed Potatoes. He's the little boy on the viewer's right. So John and I made our way to Norburn. I got to know Hugh Paul, interviewed him, and Hugh had set up meetings. I think at least he knew we could just handily waltz in and enjoy ourselves in the company of these people in Braymer. So we all went up together, and that's how I met a man named Revis Whittemeyer, who had unfortunately done away with a lot of the scores of Woolsey's that he had kept. I'm not sure that there were any compositions of Lee's or any unpublished ones, but whatever they were gone. When I asked Revis, why didn't you continue to keep these? Why did you take them out back and burn them? He said, I just didn't know what to do with them. So that's one of a handful of tragic things associated with what happened in Braymer around my getting to know the place and what had happened to Woolsey's legacy. Happier news was that Mary Donna Toomey, who was married to Mike Toomey, a man who had known Woolsey, I guess, all his life, and who played a lot of his music, likely very much in the way that the composer did, turned out to be helpful people who, to say the least. Mary Donna wanted me to have Woolsey's piano, which was being kept in the barn on their place. So just like that, I was given Woolsey's piano if only I could take it someday out off the premises and keep it as mine, which I never succeeded in doing. We never could find anybody in Braymer to help us move the piano and get it back to Kansas City. I certainly had no budget to work with. This was entirely my own doing. And so it sat there for years and years in the barn, and now nobody is quite sure where it is. So there's that oddity. Another person who Hugh took us to see was Charlie Reno, a guy Woolsey's age, probably born in 1883, who lived just up the road from the ruins of the log cabin where Calvin Lee Woolsey was born in Tenney's Grove. And that's south of Braymer, just on the Ray County side of the Caldwell-Ray County line. That was another world. I was so moved by the quilted look of the land, all of this billowing array of fields down the slope from the hill containing this fragment of a cabin where Woolsey had come into the world. And just across the road from that was still open old store of Tenney's Grove run by a man named Claude, who had it to himself and had his own world in there. That store looked as if it had not changed since the 20s. I've never seen anything like it since, and who knows if it would even be possible anywhere anymore. But that was the world where Woolsey had been born, and just up the road from the store was Charlie Reno's place. Sitting back, I remember, in a grove of trees, kind of dark. And he remembered all kinds of things about Lee Woolsey from earlier. I recorded that interview just as I'd recorded a lot of what Hugh Paul had to tell me. Unfortunately, I don't know where those tapes are. With all my moves and my struggle to keep things archivally placed, which has often failed, I have to think that they're not lost, but they're certainly inaccessible and have been for a long time. A couple of bona fide tragedies happened soon after I was in Braymer. One, Charlie Reno, I was told, was beaten to death by a local farmer, somebody who had an ugly reputation all his life, who thought that Charlie was hoarding a fortune. There was no such thing. He was convicted, and I'm sure he spent the rest of his lonely life in prison. Also, Mike Toomey, who I didn't meet, the man who played Woolsey's music, whose wife gave me the Woolsey piano, was in a hospital. I think it was a mental hospital. Soon after that time, not long after we had a conversation on the phone, our only direct communication, and he jumped out the window and died. So these terrible events came into play after my departure, and if they didn't literally influence, I see them in retrospect as being a part of the substance of my piece, Braymer, with which I'll close this presentation. Braymer itself, I thought, was such a lyrical, caressing place. Eating in the diner there led me to think that so little of substance had changed since the 50s. It was a world on its own. It was a place where time had decided to just take a nap and offer us a respite of what I, more than ever, now see as a far better time in the history of this country. It was magical in its understated, subtle way. So I think very fondly of Braymer. I haven't been back since the big research adventure. I'll say a few things about Woolsey's music. First, it's a very lyrical music. The melodic appeal should be evident to any listener. It's also it's also a music of great warmth and sentiment. I might even say sentimental and not in a pejorative fashion. Woolsey partakes, at least as evidently as most other ragtime composers, of the late 19th century sensibility that embraces sentiment to the point of the sentimentality which in the 20th century we were encouraged to eschew up to a point, which I think was a cultural inversion. I think the embracing of sentiment is so important that if it becomes excessive, that's fine. The important thing is to make sure that any aesthetic communication is emotively charged. That's essential in my hierarchy of needs as a listener and my requirements of self as a composer. Woolsey answers that very nicely for a homespun, quasi-self-taught, and certainly sounding at times like a self-taught, highly independent musical figure, totally on his own. There's a lot of sheer melodic beauty in the work of C.L. Woolsey that I'm sure will be evident to those of you who are new to it. There's a playfulness that's mentioned from time to time, sometimes a wry character in some of Woolsey's passages. And perhaps in conjunction with that, I've also noted a kind of flirtatious, sexy characteristic, which I find very fetching. You can find that quite evidently in Medic Rag, which will be the third piece I'll play. Something else that happens that you'll note in a couple of the Woolsey pieces is the adding a fifth in the bass octave, especially when the bass is in both. That kind of, and of course it's initially a fifth, and then it becomes a third, within a sixth, etc. But that middle note in the bass octave is a trait that we associate with folk ragtime practice, but which is usually not included in scores. In Mashed Potatoes and Lover's Lane Glide, his last rag published, we see wonderfully idiomatic usage of that in the score. It's all there for us to see. So Woolsey becomes a great scholarly case study for the student of this folk ragtime / small town sound world. I think Woolsey has his own significance, as does, say, Charles Hunter, the much better known folk ragtime composer. Woolsey's music, I think, is unmistakably his own, quite distinctive in every piece. A personality emerges which is vital, extremely warm, caressingly human in all of Woolsey's ragtime works. And I hope that this video might be the beginning of a new level of appreciation of Woolsey's little output. So with that, we will leap into the world of Dr. C.L. Woolsey of Braymer, Missouri, and I think you'll be moved, affected, and find a lot to remember about what you'll hear now. Well, this is Funny Bones, Calvin Lee Woolsey's first published rag from 1909, published by the Remick Company. What a lovely, contrast-rich piece. I know of nothing else like the introduction, the 16-bar A minor introduction to Funny Bones with its soulful, wailing character. And in my mind, it can't help but be personally linked to that wonderful, billowing, quilt-like landscape where Calvin Lee Woolsey was born in Tenney's Grove. The log cabin, by the time I saw it in '79, overgrown with vines and bushes, but which looked out over this pleated world of pure, unadulterated lyricism. That's what I like to associate with this beautiful piece. You'll hear some of Woolsey's playfulness, especially in the third theme, and maybe a touch of that sexy, quasi-naughty character that he has in the last theme. So here then is C.L. Woolsey's Funny Bones. Mashed Potatoes is perhaps the best known of the Woolsey pieces today, although they're all obscure. Being included in Trevor Tishner's folio Ragtime Rarities, it had a chance to reach people earlier on that scale than all the other Woolsey rags except for Medic, which was also included. Mashed Potatoes is the most medley-like of the Woolsey rags. It's the most representative of what I think most people mean when they speak of folk ragtime, a folk rag, that small town sound. The strains don't have that much to do with each other. That's not to say that they don't work as a whole, but there is a jangling kind of quasi-disconnection about this, like they just came together because they fell into this world and became a piece. You know, they don't have a seamless, organic identity within the work as a whole. Each section is its own little world. And each says a lot about the identity of folk ragtime and about what Woolsey's vision means in that context. So you'll hear some of Woolsey's darker side in the B strain of this, which first appears in A minor, then in D minor. It comes back. And there's a lot of crazy textural variety that you'll see in this piece. And then it concludes with this march, which is very unlike anything else in Woolsey's production. I've never verified this. I would like to know, but Traber had the idea that the last section was closely based on a Sousa march. So it's easy to believe that's possible. So anyway, this piece evinces a kind of very loosely held together, quasi-improvisatory envisioning of the homespun folk rag composer. So Woolsey's not like this. This is quintessentially like that. So here then, Mashed Potatoes. The title comes from playing the piano. Mashing potatoes, playing the piano. He really mashed potatoes. He really played that. That's the vernacular of the time that the title comes from. Here's Mashed Potatoes by C.L. Woolsey. comes Medic Rag, which is, I believe, likely the most technically challenging of all the early folk ragtime small town sound compositions. It's certainly Woolsey's most challenging. These octaves are reminiscent of the classic ragtime density of James Scott or the early jazz challenges of Ferdinand Jelly-Roll Morton. It's a very ambitious and, for many pianists, a daunting texture to undertake. It's a well-written piece. This is along with Funny Bones, the Woolsey composition that reflects a kind of conventional professionalism in part writing and voice leading. Whether he received help with that or not, we don't know. I think there's a reasonable chance that he did. And it really comes together effectively, in small part because of that. So here then, work which I think has great rewards. The trio, that is the third section, especially with this playful, innocent, sexy quality that I think is the best example of that side of the Woolsey character. So look for that. It'll probably reach out and grab you anyway. Here then is Medic Rag by C.L. Woolsey. Lover's Lane Glide is the last Woolsey rag to be published, and in some ways it's his best work. It certainly reaches an expressive territory not shared with the early ones. It's an overtly intense and heartfelt piece that I think has more in common with the greater possibilities of ragtime as a whole. It's not limited in its vision. It is a piece where some of the oddities of Woolsey's part writing and voice leading, doubling, show what he didn't know that trained composers know. But that's a minor thing. I've adjusted a bit of that. I like to stay very close to the score with everything that I do. In Woolsey's case, I do tweak a few items that get in the way in my strongly held view of the potential of the beauty of what he's done. So there is some of that, but there are also many places where I keep exactly what he has and all of its unknowing oddity. I'm used to that, being someone who has specialized at various times in my life in small town ragtime. There's a lot of longing in this piece. I find the last section to be the crown of Woolsey's output. So it's always a very poignant thing for me when I perform it. So here then is Calvin Lee Woolsey's Lover's Lane Glide. This is my Braymer from 1980, the piece that grew directly out of my experience of the adventure of original research in Braymer, Missouri on Calvin Lee Woolsey in September of 1979. There's a lot of yearning and hints of pathos in this piece for the reasons I mentioned earlier, at least obliquely. It's a moody portrait of a place that I instantly loved and relates to the broader territory that I profoundly love of rural Missouri very much. So here then, from 1980, is my Braymer.